Hello everyone, I'm Ben Eady and I'm the Online Media Manager for ModernAnalyst.com, the premier online community for business analysts. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar titled Avoiding the Baggage Trap, a practical approach to data mapping and traceability. Today's featured speaker is Omar Masri from Quest Software. The webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, including the Q&A session. So make sure to submit your questions in advance using the questions feature on the webinar software. I'd also like to say thank you to Handysoft for sponsoring this event, and at this time, I'll turn it over to Omar to get us started.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Omar Masri, and today I'll be presenting Avoiding the Data Baggage Trap, a practical approach to mapping and traceability. Just a little bit of background about myself. I'm currently the Chief Architect for Quest Software's BI Solutions, and I have 15 plus years of development and consulting experience. And the specialties that type of projects that I work on are data migrations, BI solutions, project recovery, and product innovation and solution design. I guess when you look at that list, you might think I'm sort of a lunatic, or those are some of the hardest type of projects to work on. So before I start, the objectives of this presentation are to give you a better understanding of the analyst role, to identify projects that are data baggage hotspots. And if I slow here, it's because I'm watching the screen to make sure you can that the presentation is refreshing. And finally, to learn 6 easy principles to help deal with data baggage. Before we start, I think we have a poll that we could take about what sort of projects you guys work on. So if we can kick off that first poll. So while that poll is going on, the first thing we'll do is get some background information on some of the key terms that we're going to be discussing and how they relate to the role of the analyst and to data baggage. Then we are going to discuss the project data baggage hotspots. Okay, so it seems mainly system integration interfaces and business process. Okay, so if we go back to the presentation. All right, so to kick off, we'll first get some background information on some of the key terms that we're going to be discussing, how they relate to the analyst role. Then we'll look at some of the project data baggage hotspots, and then we'll discuss the 6 principles on how to deal with these issues, some tooling, and then finally future-proofing your data processes, and we'll have a Q&A session. Okay, so to start off, let's first consider data. The world currently has about a zettabyte worth of data, and it's growing at a very fast rate. And does anyone know what comes after a zettabyte? And the answer is a yottabyte. Which is pretty interesting because yotta is a pretty small guy when you consider the amount of data that it's supposed to be. Now, it does raise the question as to why is there so much data, and why is it growing at such a velocity? So the reason why there's so much data is because there are so many more companies and systems producing data. And the role of the analyst is to deal and make use of that data and make it usable to the systems and processes, which goes to our first definition, that data and analysts both exist to support production systems and decision-making processes. However, the existence of data and analysts alone doesn't ensure that processes and systems can be seamlessly implemented, maintained, changed, or even used. So just because we show up to work and press our little button here doesn't mean that things magically happen as an analyst. And just because data is sitting in a server somewhere next to another server doesn't mean they're going to automatically work together and everything's going to run smoothly. So what depends? What does that actually depend on? So how well data supports systems and processes depends on how usable or meaningful the data set is, and how well the processes that create the meaning and data set are actually understood. Mapping, scrubbing, and transforming are operations that give data meaning. And traceability is simply having visibility over those operations. So I guess we could say that mapping is a translation operation that transforms raw data into a form that is meaningful to another process or system. So what do we mean by meaningful? Let's have a look at a little example. Here we have some raw data. We have an integer, a float, a date, an alphanumeric. Now, without context, this data is pretty much meaningless. So to convert that data into information, we have to give it context. So here we have the same raw data, and the 38 can become a person's age. The float becomes a currency's fair pot price. The date is a date of a sales transaction. 93,000 is the number of tables that we have to map for the conversion. The alphanumeric is a table we have to convert. So data plus context equals useful information. Now the question is, useful to who and to what and at which level? And this is why mapping has to be done at different levels to ensure that the required information is actually created. So you have mapping at the data level, at the physical model level, physical model being your tables and your columns, logical model being your entities. Then you have your processes, so now your transaction types like purchase, like a sales order, and then you have finally your systems. So these are all the levels that we have to actually do mapping for. Now, we've spoken a bit about the background about data. How about the analyst role? How does he fit into this equation? So before we start, we'll take the second poll about what type of function you do in your analytical work. All right, so it seems the majority of people are actually doing mapping, obviously, for the topic of the presentation, and overwhelmingly, actually. So. And we have 13% of people doing other activities, which is interesting. All right, so how well an analyst supports processes and systems depends on their skills, communication, technical, and social. The most important ones are communication and social, because sometimes as you're working through your data baggage, you don't have the technical skill to actually dig into the code straight away, so you have to deal with a lot of layers in the team structures and different personalities. Then secondly, how well an analyst understands the process and systems that are involved, and finally, the analyst's ability to give meaning at multiple levels. So what's it mean to give meaning at multiple levels? Let's have a look at an example. Here we have a physical to physical mapping for the conversion. And the source object describes where you're going to get the data from, and then you have the target object where the data is going to go into, and then you have the mapping of the table and fields directly. Now, on face value, this sort of looks like it's sufficient to develop something from, but you realize that there's actually gaps in the requirements as to what's actually required in the target object, the data quality, what's actually the data quality of the source, how are we going to reconcile, there's a thing here that specifies how this is going to be reconciled, and also what processes are going to consume this data to ensure that we need to ensure that we can meet those requirements. And all of these gaps in this mapping document impact traceability and development, etc. So let's have a look at the same map, but now we're going to have considerations for those gaps. So here now we have the target requirements better specified as to what type of data is required, and then we have a strategy for the data quality issues. We have we specify how we're going to reconcile this data, how it's going to be included in business processes, and finally we have the actual mapping. So not all maps need to be this verbose, but you have to have this data somewhere in your documentation. And then when developers come and look at this or develop these parts of the maps, this information has to be there for them. So more context equals happier developers, reconciliation teams, and reduced project risk, and overall improved traceability. All right, so in summary, the analyst has 3 functions. He transforms data from systems into information, and he can do so at multiple levels: at the data level, at the physical level, the logical level, and the business level. And the business includes processes and systems. And then the second thing that analyst does is they iterate over information and provide thought over the information. They providing trends, forecasts, predictive analytics, and then finally the analyst sometimes is forced to go and discover root causes and trace across the technology stack, going from reports to marts to warehouses to systems and then in external interfaces. And based on your poll results, the majority of everyone here is actually working on the transform side, and only a couple of people working in analyze and actually tracing through the processes. All right, so what are some of the obstacles that analysts face in doing this? The first one is actually decision makers, right? So we have the managers and the people that make decisions, and you're either going to have to help mold or live with these decisions, right? So these are decisions that impact requirements such as vendor and system selection processes, what is in and out of scope for your interface or your migration project, data quality decisions, what data is going to be kept in, what are we going to do with the set of data that doesn't match up, how are we going to reconcile, and also how is this going to impact business processes. And then finally, when the system goes live or the interface is implemented, what's a decommissioning, especially if you're turning one off or creating an enhancement to an interface. The second obstacle that the analysts face is obviously data baggage. So what is data baggage? Data baggages are all those existing ETL processes, data layers, reports, repositories, existing interfaces and systems that are heavily relied on, but whose domain knowledge has been slowly lost over the years as people trickle away off projects, right? Now, these are the things that every analyst has to learn when they start a new project at a site, or they walk into a new site. This is your learning curve. So you have to deal with this data baggage, and you have to help reduce it. So what are some common data baggage hotspots? Right, they're in the data layer projects. You have enterprise and BI shadow projects, interface and orchestration projects, and then you have data migration projects. I think here primarily a lot of people said they worked on interfaces and orchestration, which makes sense because that's mainly operational type of development. So let's have a look at some of the hotspots for the data layer projects. Data layers usually go from raw data to the approved BI layer, and every line between the boxes is actually an interface, and every interface is a map, and then which is a potential area where domain knowledge can be lost, which becomes data baggage, and people don't know what is actually behind that. And then every box sometimes has sub-processes that are that have their own complexities and mappings in between them. And then you extrapolate this to the department level and the user level, and then you have you add more complexity, and this is what IT tries to centralize the BI and create a single domain model for this to minimize the level of documentation that they have to create. Otherwise, you get data baggage. So when the rate of change to these data layers is greater than the rate of documentation, you get data baggage. And it's the larger the data layer projects, the more unsustainable the model is. And there's current new tooling to help reduce the complexity of these data layer projects to ensure that data baggage is not created and even reduced. All right, so the second type of project are BI projects. And here we have our enterprise BI stack going from data sources to actual reports. And in that block architecture diagram, you have the layers, and in between them you always have mappings and etc. And what usually happens is there's a shadow IT department, and a developer does extracts and creates spreadmarks, and then he pushes that information to business users, and then the business users want to go and get more data, so they feed it into that process again. So where are the data baggage potential hotspots? Well, obviously in the enterprise stack, and all the work that the developers actually do, because as developers leave, usually shadow IT isn't well documented, so business users then go to IT for support saying, can you please help us with this report that Fred worked on, but Fred's gone, Fred was not part of IT, bam, you have data baggage, right? The next sort of example is system interface and orchestration projects. So here's a simple sequence diagram of an interface, point of sales creating a purchase order for JDE through a middleware provider, and then the JDE system spitting out back the invoice and the ASNs, etc. And then the data baggage here usually ends up being in the middleware, and also in the source JDE system. Again, as the system ages, resources leave, people understand less about the system, and you get data baggage. All right, and finally, we have our data migration project, right? Where you have your source data, and you create a mapping for translating your data, and then you stage it, you cleanse it, you usually create a delta of data that's sort of not going to be transformed, then you transform it into the new model, and then you push it into the new target. So the areas of data baggage there are initially in your was-is translation, so your data translation, and then in your delta layer, and when you transform to the target, and then finally the reconciliation. Right? So with migration projects, as opposed to system interfaces, migration projects are temporary projects. They live and die, whereas an interface is usually permanent. So the level of documentation has to be greater for the interfaces. So some key points for each project type, right? Again, migration projects are temporary. The key risks are reconciliation and process continuity. What's that mean? When we go live after post-migration, you have to ensure that the business can continue operating. That otherwise, the business is stuffed. For interface projects, it's really more transactional monitoring, and the key risks are performance, so that interface has to perform well. And also we try to avoid data loss or system errors, right? We want to lose any orders. I've worked on many interfaces where orders were just getting lost, right? And that's like bad news. And then, or transactions getting lost, and then actual material sitting on docks because the correct interface didn't receive the message to actually pick it up for the pick. And so it's really critical that it perform and that there's no data loss. And then your BI and data layer projects, your key risks are more about accuracy versus flexibility. Now, there's a greater detail on actually how these compare, and there's an appendix that you can review. And or if we have time, we can actually look at them after. All right, so overcoming the obstacles, so sorting out the baggage. So how do we go from walking into a site and having all this baggage there to converting it to something that's actually usable and manageable? Or even worse, never creating all that baggage. So when you leave the site or finish the project, that the person after you doesn't have this mess to deal with. So I guess first we'll discuss why the principles are important. And the first thing is that the principles will help improve the quality of your mapping outputs, like we saw in that example, right? They're going to improve the traceability over the final process. And more importantly, they're going to improve the requirements gathering phase, which is key. And in essence, they give you a value-based decision framework. And why is that important? Because the most important things that an analyst does is sort of help make decisions or help make decisions. And if you don't know what you value, then it's very difficult to gauge whether your decisions are impacting your scope, whether they're good or bad. So you always have to go back to your core value, because there's always a lot of unknowns in data projects, and which means you always have to go back to what was valued in the beginning. So that goes to principle 1, which is start with the objective. So if you have no scope, then you have no hope, right? Because the scope of the project really drives your mapping considerations. What do you have to include in these maps? So whether you put it all in one big map, like in my little example, or whether you have separate documents, that's really a tactical decision. But you have to ensure that all these things are documented and visible to the correct audience. So system and process interfaces, right? You have to determine what's the scope for your process, which systems are going to be into play, which interfaces are into play, what are the data quality and reconciliation strategies, how are you going to monitor this interface, how are you going to ensure you have no data loss, what's going to be your archiving, logging, and reporting strategy. As you create logs for your interfaces, how are you going to manage all that log files? Are you going to archive them? How far back are you going to, all those things have to be decided early on for you to be able to even begin to develop. And then finally, your implementation strategy, your go live. So principle 2 is validate key assumptions. Now there's always a data quality gap between what people think they have before these projects start versus what they actually really have. And this data quality gap is really the leading cause of scope creep, right? So these are the things like when someone says, oh, we only have this type of transaction, or the data will only ever be like this, or you really have to ensure that those key assumptions about your data are actually correct. Because otherwise, you will have to create new maps and a lot of rework to existing maps, right? So what are some of the potential causes and some of the key things you have to listen out? You have to sort of look for prior conversions in the data, maybe upgrades to systems that people have forgotten about, or journaling. Journaling is when there's errors in the transactional data, and then people go and update the headers so their reporting can be correct, which is fine for their reporting and the system's operating, but usually conversions and interfaces work with transactional data. That means there's now a reconciliation gap. And the final cause is the business process just aren't followed. So even though it's a documented business process, people actually follow a different one. And some people do it this way and some people do it that way, so your data is actually different. So you have to hammer all those assumptions. Principle 3 is reconciling from the start, right? Because this is how you test your mapping. If principle 2 was the scope of your mapping, this is how you test the mapping. And you have to build in your reconciliation for your migration projects and your monitoring for your interface projects as part of your code, right? And you have to define your reconciliation pack and your monitoring strategy pack early on. And for migration projects in particular, you have to ensure you reconcile that source system, right, before you even begin. Reporting on the header, because usually corporates will report on their headers, or maybe it's data in the warehouse, but we never convert from the warehouse. Usually people convert transaction lines, and again, you're going to have a lot of gaps in quality and reconciliation there. So it's really important to set the expectation for the things that will and also will not reconcile early on, and the impact on some of their statistics that they use for that are not sort of operational, so non-statutory financials. And then the fourth principle is to design and implement with traceability in mind. So this is how visible the mapping is across all those layers, from your mapping documents to the code to your reconciliation. You have to ensure that you have readable code and that you have as much automation as you can, and that you have collaboration for your so you can collaborate over your documents, questions, and issues that are raised. So what's readable code mean? Sometimes developers get very excited and they try to put everything into one little function that so they can reuse it, and it looks great, but then 2 months from now they go and then no one knows what that little function does, but it's such a key piece, everyone's scared to touch it. So that's terrible for mapping and data baggage. So principle 5 is automating from the start. Now the numbers of iterations are key to any data project. So why is that? Because this is when you test your mapping. It's essentially the automated testing for the map. So interface projects are always automated. Migration projects sometimes have a lot of manual processing in them. They need to really push that automation in early to flush out any data quality issues and unknowns. Okay, essentially for data projects, you don't know until you flip the switch, right? And then you can see all the gaps that you actually have. So you have to have as many runs as you can. And then helps eliminate manual execution errors, and everything is 100% traceable, because you can see that the sets of data that are created are being done through non-manual processes. And finally, you get good go-live execution time statistics, right? So you can see how long is it actually going to take. Is my interface performing? Is my data migration going to make it within the time window that I have to do it in? I don't know if some projects require a 24-hour migration from start to finish, and then the reconciliation is 2 days for the accountants to do. And finally, principle 6 is using the right tool for the right job. So here we have, so there's a couple, I'll list the needs for the tools, and then we'll talk about each tool that sort of can get used. So we have requirements and mapping. There's many tools available, and a lot of people use Excel, but you could sometimes, for larger projects that are more permanent, you have the case tools and other tools. You have issues and questions management. Again, there's many available. There's things for small projects. I would recommend something as light as sort of like Redmine. I try to tend to move away from using email and just Excel for issues and questions because they do get lost, and it's almost hard to communicate with that method. And then document collaboration, there's many document collaboration tools. And then you need a data validation and discovery tool, and you need sort of one set of tools for your guys who are technical and maybe another set of tools for you guys that are not. You need sandboxing data and virtual data layers. You need some form of basic reporting and automation and data modeling and diagramming. Now, this is my shameless plug. So again, there's many tools that can do these things, but Quest Software also has a suite of products in the Toad family product line that gives solutions, productivity tools for those solutions. So you have the Toad for name your database. You also have the Toad for analysts, which allows you to connect to name your database, and it also has basic reporting, automation, a virtual sandbox, essentially all those things that any analyst is going to need to do these type of projects. And then we have the Toad data model for your diagramming needs. So you could also use a product suite that has UML modeling, US case modeling, report generation, code engineering, and then a specialized data migration type tool like Informatica or ETL. Interface projects, they already have, there'll be a tool defined for their project like web methods or some other type of BizTalk orchestration type tools. Or you can use, for migration projects that are more temporary, you can use the low cost and reliable method, which is just Excel. You organize your folders correctly. You name your scripts correctly. You have a task-based runner. There's a lot of task-based runners that are free that can handle single task, parallel tasks, variables, and etc. And then you have your SAS issues and question system, and then you have your SQL IDE, like Toad for data analyst. So I've done 65 million GBP size conversion projects using nothing more than Excel and Toad, right? So, and then the task-based runner. So you don't have to have these super complex tools to be able to do rollouts to 32 countries and whatnot. It's more about how you organize yourself and to ensure that you've considered the right things in terms of your requirements of following the 6 principles. All right, so in terms of future-proofing, you have to ensure that the key outputs exists in terms of your strategic documents, so your reconciliation pack that we spoke about, the documents on the strategies, on your archiving, and of course all your maps and etc. And you have to have a change history for those documents. And then you need stronger collaboration tools always help out. So collaborating over your documents, over your conversations and train of thought. The less email and less Excel you use for your actual conversations, the better. And the more traceable 2 months, 3 months from now, the process will be. And then finally, eliminating complexity through the reduction of the number of components that are actually required to deliver a solution. So let's have what's that actually mean? Let's have a little example by re-looking at our shadow BI diagram. So there's a lot of complexity in all the little blue lines, and that can be really simplified with a simple virtual data layer. Now, if you've never heard of a virtual data layer before, it's simply a layer that allows you to connect to a lot of things and then allow you to do joins across all those connections without having to do any ETL. So it sort of does it for you. And these layers sometimes have sandboxes where you can sort of sandbox data in, so you can cache it, and then you can do your work. Right? So essentially, you eliminate the need to create data integration only marts. So when you do that, it gets rid of a lot of all that mapping to set up that mart. So you get rid of that whole mart altogether, and it just creates a simpler solution. So less components, less data baggage. All right. So and then the final way to future-proof is again to recognize your data baggage hotspots and to ensure that you do whatever you can to minimize them, and also to follow the 6 principles to ensure that you're not creating more baggage, and also creating enough documentation and putting in some new tooling to help reduce that that data baggage. All right, so I guess that's the presentation. I guess we can go into the questions. So here's the URL for Toad World, and I also have a couple of index slides that sort of show the characteristics of each project type and how to apply some of the key considerations for the key artifacts, some of the tools you would want to use, and the principles for you to review. So then the next question by G. Lovelance: do you think a data governance policy program should be required for understanding organizational data issues? Again, that it's a good question about data governance is always important, and I guess it really takes into account, you have to take into account the permanence of your project. So if you have no existing data governance and you're doing a data migration, and it may not be a wise thing to go and implement data governance for that temporary project. For a lot more long-term projects like interfaces and data layers that are more permanent,
Muted.
the IT, then yes, you need data governance. You have to have data stewards to ensure that data quality is there, to ensure that ownership
Unmuted.
of that data as new data sets are brought in. So yes, data governance is critical. And this becomes more critical as your data asset becomes more permanent to your and more part of your infrastructure. All right. So how do I scroll to the first question? Here we go. How do you find data loss possibility? So this is by Jay and Sandy. So how to find data loss? So essentially, when I've had to go and investigate existing sites and have to go and monitor interfaces, and there is no proper monitoring or logging for that interface, then you essentially have to trace back the interface, right? Okay, where is this data coming from? You find that it's coming from this system A, and look at its output and see that output. So it's a very labor-intensive exercise, but there's no other way of doing it. But as you do that process, you have to ensure that you put in some of the basic monitoring. Otherwise, you're finding where the gap could be, but then you're not actually helping the business. So you have to do both. You have to discover and resolve and patch up and fix. All right, so the next question is,
Muted.
can I give you a demo of Toad for data analysts? I don't have the demo data here for you, but I think there's other presentations about Toad for data analysts already at analysts.com. So you can just have a look of the demos that are there. So does Quest provide any tools to aid with logical and object mapping? I think you have with the data modeling tool, you can create some of those diagrams. So have a look at the Quest Data Modeler. So the answer to the question is yes, that was Jeffrey Skillman. Will Toad for Cloud work with Salesforce.com by Logan Marshall? Yes. It will. So Salesforce.com is one of the adapters for it, and it's going to have a lot of adapters like OBI, analysis services, many of the NoSQL databases, at least the core ones. So you'll be able to view and write SQL across all of those tools. Okay, so another question by Rodney Somerville. What does shadow IT represent? So shadow IT is sort of found in every corporate. That doesn't have, well, actually in every corporate. You have your IT department. The IT department, they sort of create a data asset, which is the main enterprise BI solution, right? But then in every department, there's always some guy who wants just a little bit more, maybe a different view of the data, and he does something different, creates a new spreadsheet, extracts data from one of the systems. That's the beginning of shadow IT. So it's a battle of consistency that enterprise IT delivers, and the flexibility that users and departments want. So sometimes finance departments hire developers on their own. They're not part of IT. They're sort of under the finance budget, and they'll have access to databases and really complicated spreadsheets to do their work. That's sort of shadow IT, because IT calls them shadow IT because when a business user usually says, "Hi, my report's not working," IT goes, "What do you mean? Which report?" This risk modeling tool, like spreadsheet, and they go, "It's not under support. We don't support that. We don't know about it. Someone else. We don't know where it comes from." That's why it's called shadow IT. So here's a question from Ellen Larson. I have Toad for Oracle Experts. Does that include the data modeling tool? The quote titled Data Modeler is a separate tool. So you may want to just go to the Toad World site and have a look at that one. So I have another question from Danielle Hedgke. I do have the Toad for Data Analyst. Problem is no one else is in the company has that program, and they have all the versions of Oracle. Well, I think there's currently a beta program for the Toad for Data Analyst, so you can tell those guys who don't have it to go and get the newer version of the tool. From Mark Goldberg, what about mapping from one system to another? It's not raw data, but two sets of, yeah, so I get a term for raw data, meaning it's raw to system 2. So it may not be, it may be known to you, the analyst, but the second system doesn't know about the first, right? So in essence, it has no context. So data without context is raw, even though it comes from a known system. But correct, yeah, if you know your system A, you know that data, and you know system B, they're both known to you. It's not like it's some unknown feed. But that's the point that I was trying to make, that it's unknown, it's raw to system 2. That's why the analyst is actually trying to map it. So here's an interesting question from Danielle Hedgke. So if you're entering a new role and you have data baggage, is it better to just recreate a completely new process, or undo the one that's existing? Well, I guess it's sort of a cost-benefit. Sometimes, if you have the time, and you can just create something new, I guess it's sort of ideal. And from an engineering perspective, engineers always want to rewrite stuff, so that's like sort of like the first tendency. So you sort of always have to pull yourself back as to what's going to be the impact if I change this. Am I breaking? So it depends how isolated. So I guess to answer the question, it depends how isolated that process is. Do you understand all the peripheral impacts on that little bit that you're trying to alter. If you can get a grip around that, then you can make a good decision as to whether you can basically say, okay, that's a black box. It only has these 4 or 5 things connected to it. I'll tell the 4 or 5 stakeholders of this process that I'm gonna be doing some development to it. Take it out, snap in your new one, and then they can verify. If you can't get a grip on what is used in this middle piece, then you're going to have to get into larger impact analysis work for that. But again, it's a case-by-case basis. But that's where you would go: is what's the impact? What am I going to break if I change it? If I get rid of this? So another question about is reconciling. Because I did touch on the point. This is again from Danielle. When reconciling, is it better to work with developer? Can you work without one, etc.? So how do you code reconciliation into these projects or in migration projects, etc.? The first thing is you have to specify how it's going to be reconciled and from when. That's like point 1. So what is going to be reconciled against? And then usually a developer will have he'll write his module to move the data or write this particular interface. Then on top of that, essentially in his test bed, he's going to have to write that reconciliation module, right? That goes and selects the sum of this or ensures that this transaction actually pushed through. 2 transactions came in, and then 2 transactions went out in this new format. So try to work it in that way. You always have the larger reconciliation packs, which are more global, which a more business person does. I guess the functional reconciliation, I guess you would call validation. And then have the developer also create the output automatically for the more business type of reconciliation. So a developer will do his functional validation for himself to ensure that his code works. But then at the same time, he'll create the required output. So maybe the exception report for the business person to then go and do his analysis, etc. And I try to work that in at the same time. So as the conversions or interfaces get coded, they start spitting out the correct stuff for the right people, and that's the idea. So you say, okay, if I've done module A is finished, you'll have the validation exception logging, and then you'll have the exceptions for the business analysts to come and review the accountants and system checkers. Okay, so here's another question. What are the major challenges in data migration from a mainframe system, and how can a data analyst overcome that? Now, I guess the major challenge that I've always had from systems that you can't just readily connect to is always getting the data staged, right? How do you stage the data? Once the data is staged in some form of database, then it sort of just becomes a traditional conversion. The issue is how long is it actually going to take to stage the data? Usually you have an execution time window, and sometimes staging the data is going to blow it out. So that's the major challenge from mainframe systems. And what can an analyst actually do to overcome it? It's really a technical problem of how quickly they can get the data off the mainframe. Now, if you have programs that can read your data, you have no choice. You have to stage it somewhere. Otherwise, you can't begin to work. So unless you're going to start coding in the actual mainframe language, you got to get it off there. Yeah. So from Hila Meta, is metadata part of the key artifacts? Yeah. So I guess if the metadata is created by and if the metadata forms part of your mapping and documentation, then yes, right? So that's your model essentially. So not all projects actually have metadata. I guess the more permanent your project is, the more requirement is for data, so then people can, so this persists. All right, can I go back to page 17? This is from Janine Sanders, and use it as a case for data mapping spreadsheet. So the mapping documents, we usually have your source file and your target file at the top. The first column is to see which fields are actually required, so mandatory fields. And then I have the extract table. And then you have your, so this is a three-stage conversion. So it goes from extract to a staging table, and then you have your target. So depending if you have 2 or 3, you may get rid of the middle column. But you have your source one, your target, the data type that it's in, and then your final target and data type that it's in, and then the sort of considerations for each column, or maybe a rule that you're going to have to code into your statement. And what I personally like to do is I take this map and I actually create a source for a migration project. I will create a source view that actually has this listed. So then when we go over the post-implementation of a test conversion, we can actually verify that the source objects actually tie back to these columns, and then use those cursors in the code that actually do the inserts. So I hope I answered your question.
I'd like to thank you, Omar, for a very informative presentation, and a thank you to everyone for attending today's Modern Analyst webinar. I wanted to point out that the webinar, along with the slides, will be archived at ModernAnalyst.com within a few days. This concludes today's event, and we hope you have a great day.